Good afternoon, everyone. This is a session that's looking at the intersection between climate change and health. Human and planetary well-being are inextricably linked. Climate change has been described as being the greatest threat to human health during the 21st century, but at the same time, the greatest opportunity for addressing the social and environmental drivers of health outcomes. We see around the world today the impacts of climate change destroying lives and livelihoods, but also creating significant adverse health impacts, whether that's as a result of air pollution, whether it's the result of extreme heat, whether it's a result of changing environmental conditions, altering the transmission of diseases, or whether it's about the drivers of climate change impacting with food, water, or financial insecurity, exacerbating health outcomes. So what we're going to do in the discussion today, we're joined by three distinguished panelists, in particular to look at how both governments and the private sector can respond to climate change in the context of looking at health, how we can put climate change and health together and look at a joint response to the two challenges. So let me start by introducing our panelists. First of all, can I welcome Soumya Swaminathan, who's Chief Scientist at the World Health Organization, then Feike Sijbesma, who's Honorary Chairman of Royal DSM, and finally Mauricio Cardenas, who's Senior Research Scholar at Columbia University. For those of you who are watching online, please share on social media, and if you do so, use the hashtag WEF22. So, Soumya, can I turn to you first of all? We've talked about, in the introduction, how there's an intersection, a fundamental intersection between climate change and health. But perhaps climate change in particular hasn't always been discussed in those terms. So I wonder whether you could describe from your perspective that intersection between the two topics and whether we ought to be doing more, both in terms of describing that intersection, but also in terms of the response.
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. I would start off by saying that the climate crisis is a health crisis. And it's probably not thought of that way or understood that way. But if you really think about what drives people to become ill and develop diseases, and you look at the risk factors for people falling ill, we see that about a quarter of the deaths that occur every year, so we have about 50+ million deaths a year which occur around the world. About 14 million of those are directly related to environmental risk factors, mainly air pollution, water, sanitation, and things which are really outside the health sector traditionally. So the health sector is thinking about building hospitals and healthcare centers and treating diseases and diagnosing them. But we don't think upstream really about the things that we need to be doing which are the risk factors which actually make you ill. So there's a huge benefit to health. And I think if people start looking at it as an investment, anything that you do to reduce the impacts of climate change, going to moving towards net zero, the clean energy transition, adopting the standards for clean air, and again, many of them you have co-benefits. You have health co-benefits for practically every environmental action that you take. If you encourage people and set up cities so that there's more cycling and walking rather than driving, then you're not only reducing emissions, but you're also promoting good health. You have cities designed with more open spaces, with greenery, with parks, etc. It not only absorbs CO2, but it's also providing a space for people to exercise, and it's been clearly shown from studies, randomized trials, that people who live close to green spaces have a much better quality of life and better mental health indicators. So I think we need to start framing this discourse in a way that it actually impacts people, because a lot of this is invisible. The food that we eat, for example. So we talk about moving to sustainable food systems, but that's also going to improve nutrition, and we know that malnutrition is probably the biggest risk factor for disease today. So there are many examples, but I think what we like to say is that there's no vaccine for climate change, because we're living in the era of COVID. We all talk about COVID vaccines, but we have the tools, we have the solutions. But the crisis is really a health crisis.
And how much do you see that the medical profession and the broader medical community, health community, recognizing climate change as being something that is important for that community to really embrace and understand, both in terms of the two aspects that you've been mentioning, both in terms of the determinant of physical or mental health, or in terms of the way in which healthcare is operated?
So I think there's more and more recognition of that. In fact, the WHO, we always talk about universal health coverage and primary health care, which is at the very heart of what we do. But we've now shifted the priority number one to being actually preventing disease. So we're talking about healthy well-being. And that actually spans the whole spectrum of all of the actions on the side of the environment, nutrition, water, air pollution, and so on. I think it's difficult to quantify these things, you see, because they happen over a period of time. And so if you're living in a city with, in fact, 9 out of 10 people today who are in cities are living in cities which do not meet the WHO air quality standards. So most people are breathing unhealthy air. But it's affecting your cardiovascular system, your respiratory system. The studies need to be long-term. They need to be interdisciplinary. It's not immediate cause and effect like an infectious disease. So I think part of this whole conversation needs to be to promote more interdisciplinary research. And we can talk about indicators later. Do we have the indicators to measure these changes in climate and health? We don't. And they're not really covered by the SDG indicator. So that's another area for the work.
Becky, you come from the business perspective. I wonder whether you could provide us with some examples where businesses have been looking at climate change and health in an integrated way.
Right, appreciate it, and appreciate all being present here. You said is climate causing a health crisis? I would like to say it's causing an existential crisis about our life on planet Earth. And let me quote my good friend, former boss of Greenpeace, Kumi Naidoo. And he said Greenpeace should be renamed as People Peace, because I'm not so concerned about nature. Head of Greenpeace saying that. I'm very much concerned about you, people. Because what you're doing is putting a threat to your own life. You will not be able to live healthy anymore on this planet. And after you have expelled yourself from this planet, I'm not concerned about nature at all. Nature will come back, nature will restore, and nature will flourish after you have expelled yourself. And new species will even deliver, and we will restore biodiversity. Thank you very much, Head of Greenpeace, making really aware what climate change is all about. We are threatening our own life. And sadly so, that will not be equally spread. The most vulnerable will get the first big hits, much more than maybe a lot of people in this room or other rooms, like myself. And what do we get? And I come back to the business, but air pollution. I mean, we have seen the situations in Beijing, and I've seen it in my own company, how proud the local CEO was that we could deliver mouth masks to all the people going to the office and back again every day because they could not be in the open air, but we could help them. Well, the moment we need to, and that was far before COVID, by the way. Now we're used to mouth masks, but at that moment it was a rare exception. But if we need to be proud that we can help our people not die on the way back home to work, I mean, how bad do we make it? If you look to the heat at this moment in Pakistan, in India, where for days, weeks, temperatures are above 50, where all outside work in agriculture, in construction, etc., has to stop because it's unbearable to work at 50 degrees Celsius. So, and with that, we are not building infrastructure, we're not building hospitals, we are not growing our food, etc. So we indirectly also impacting our health, directly being expelled to the heat, but indirectly also. Of course, infectious diseases will increase tremendously, and we see it already nowadays. And in fact, our whole way of living is being influenced. I go one step further. Next to all the direct effects, we will see a lot of indirect effects. If you look to food production, if food is not there, people will not be healthy. If food cannot be grown in Africa, Africa will never be healthy. If the main component of our food will be carbohydrates, we will stay alive, because you can live 20, 30 years with eating only carbohydrates, but you will get anemia, you'll get infectious diseases, you will not be healthy, etc. But you will continue to live if you feed people with carbohydrates only. So we need to think about our food patterns and the composition of our food, make it more nutritious, etc., make it more local, water, etc. So what we need to do, in my view, also is to not only fight the crisis on climate by mitigation and preventing that this happens, but to be honest, we did not do enough the last 30 years. By far not enough. And that means that from now on, next to mitigation, there's another topic on the agenda, and that's adaptation. And the Egyptians at the next COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh will put adaptation high on the agenda. Adaptations on our food production, adaptation on our healthy food production, because otherwise we will become ill and will not boost our immune system, our water systems, our cities, our infrastructure, etc., etc. And I think we need to work on both. Now, business, strange enough, has hardly looked to adaptation so far, and need to look much more in their own benefit, in the benefit of their own people. And we have seen it a couple of years ago in South Africa, shortage of drinking water. Employees do not even come to work anymore. If you cannot drink, you have an issue. Health issues, business issues, economic issues, and you turn yourself down in a downward spiral. So business need to step up, make their own analysis of their own companies, their own supply chain, and their own risk assessment. But secondly, they need, with their innovative power, also to contribute to improving and changing this in the world. Mitigation, preventing it, adaptation, addressing it when it is there. And when, again, quoting Kumi, if you don't do that, we are really threatening our life on planet Earth. And if you see to the heat, if you see to the flooding, if you see to the droughts, if you see what's happening now, not due to the Russian-Ukrainian war, but due to the droughts in Africa. We were just having a meeting with the head of the World Food Programme, the tremendous need that he has at this moment. We are really threatening the lives of many, and this is not just a few million. And what I found the most terrible of all of this, I said in the beginning, this will start with the most vulnerable people in the world. And that is not fair. They didn't cause climate change, but they will suffer the most. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Vicky has just outlined, very clearly the scale of the threats. Mauricio, you have been part of the independent panel on pandemic preparedness and response, which was established in 2020 to effectively address health threats. I wonder whether, in that context, you can lay out some of what you consider to be the top priorities to respond to this health and climate threat.
Well, thanks, Emily. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be in this panel. Think for a minute of the crisis that we have lived through in the past, say, 2 years. The health crisis of the pandemic, a climate crisis that we're every day more aware of, droughts, extreme weather events everywhere in the world, and now we have a food crisis as a result of the invasion in Ukraine. What we're seeing is really a new generation of crises that have some key elements there and are very different from the old crises that we were kind of like exposed to in the past. The last one I remember is the global financial crisis. This crisis, the three ones, are crises that are interrelated. There is a compounding effect. These are crises that are very unequalizing. They have amplified the differences in the world, the inequalities in the world. And these are crises for which we do not have the right institutions to deal with, to solve them. The global financial crisis was an issue that was dealt by the central banks, the IMF. There was pretty much a script on what to do. But with this, the new generation of crisis, we're not well prepared. And the reason why we're not well prepared is that these crises share something in common that make them particularly difficult. First of all, they cannot be fixed by one country individually. Second, they cannot be solved by aid or charity. That's not enough. Three, these crises cannot be dealt by markets alone. And I think one key element behind this crisis is that they all need a global public good. You need vaccines, you need therapies, or you need to prevent the global public bad, which is carbon emissions. And when you talk about public goods, global public goods, you need coordination. You need to act in a coordinated way. And that's where we have problems, because we don't have the right framework to provide these global public goods. I think one element here is that we need to make sure that we provide the funding to deal with these problems in a way where it's not about the philanthropy, it's not about the aid, it's about providing this global public good with our own ability to pay, each country according to the ability. And that's how we're going to build the resilience that we need in adaptation, the reduction in emissions that we need in mitigation, the health, the supply of health technologies to deal with the health crisis, and now, today, to provide the food to countries that are not going to be able to pay the prices that we're seeing today. So my call here is we're living in a time where the challenges are huge, because we need to rethink the way we deal with the problems. And the call to action is the coordination, is the supranational decision-making. You mentioned the panel for preparedness, for the pandemic preparedness and response. In the context of that panel, many of our recommendations were about providing, and Sumia, it's great that you're here, the WHO with more funding, more assessed contributions, like funding for this public good, not funding for what the donors want, not earmarked, to put it in the language of finance ministers. We also called for more ability to produce vaccines everywhere in the world, where we don't have the technology, we don't have the know-how. The mRNA vaccines are still, very limited in the production to certain countries. And we called, for example, in that panel for more authority to the WHO according to the international health regulations whenever there is a threat, rather than politicizing the decision. Make it a decision that can be taken with the knowledge, the technical knowledge, the expertise at that level, so that will prevent an outbreak becoming a pandemic. So this is about supranational decisions. And this is the new generation of crisis that we have to deal with, which is very different from what we had in the past. And unless we deal with this crisis, which are intertwined and interlinked, are crises that really compound each other, events that in the past we could think of them as concerning or dangerous, now with this compounding effect, they're really catastrophic. So this is the time we're living, and we have to be able to deliver the solutions to this new generation of crisis.
Thank you. I want to let people in the audience here ask any questions that they might have, if anybody has a question for any of the panel. while people think, one question that I might ask all the panelists, I mean, we've heard about both the threats, the urgency of the threats, and the need to have a supranational response with involving both governments and the private sector. We've seen in the course of the pandemic how governments and the private sector came together to really accelerate beyond what was, I think, imaginable, the development and rollout of vaccines. How do you think in the context of climate change we can see as that same combination coming together with that same sense of urgency to accelerate the response both on the mitigation and the adaptation side? What would you suggest we can do to try and accelerate action in the way that quite clearly the challenge requires?
Well, mankind is inhibited for good reasons of thinking sometimes long term. And there's a good Darwinistic reason why we're inhibited for that, because we need to react to short-term threats faster. So we have a fast and a slow thinking system in our brain, and we use that collectively even worse. So fast crises, we respond individually and collectively pretty fast. And that's, by the way, from a Darwinistic point of view, very good, because then there's a way to survive. But a thing like climate, and we saw that again this year in Davos, is a slowly developing thing with slowly developing consequences in which we're slowly reacting to it. This week there were several companies, and I'm from business, who said, well, I have the technology in-house to reduce my emissions with 50%. They're good. Are you doing that? No. Why not? Because my shareholders will not like it. They're good. But on the long term, we are killing, if we all do that, we are killing our own species. True on long term, but maybe not only due to me. So there's the collective and the individual actions, there's the fast and the slow moving actions. And I only give the example, and apparently the awareness is not yet there. Do you do investments to prevent that people are killed during their work in your company? Or do you say, my shareholders do not want to invest in that, and yeah, every day 10 or 20 people will be killed at work? No, no CEO will ever say that. So please realize that the crisis is that big, that implicitly you are saying that with climate and you do the same. Not immediately tomorrow morning, but that tomorrow morning will come. And apparently we do not realize that yet strong enough that this is what we are causing. And we can only help here in meetings like this, is making that aware. And the last thing is, at least for businesses, and we concluded this morning a session on that with Frans Timmermans of the European Commission, Christine Lagarde, and the Dutch Prime Minister. Let's not talk from business anymore about pledges, commitments, intentions, manifestos, etc. Let's talk about progress and what we're doing. And if we are not making progress, let us address the hurdles why we could not make progress and see how we can solve that. That makes the whole agenda more action-related. Otherwise, we have on and on these kind of meetings describing how terrible the future would look like, and slowly we are moving to that future.
So, I mean, Sumya, when we've got an estimated 4.5 million premature deaths each year from air pollution, when we've got an estimated 300,000 people, again, prematurely dying as a consequence of excess heat each year, should we really be thinking of this as a long-term issue, or is it not something that's actually impacting people here and now today?
It's absolutely urgent, and I think, I hope people can see it now. I know it's very difficult for people to imagine, die in a road traffic accident, but you can see that. So I think measuring and making the case, like we know that if the Paris Accord, if everybody moved ahead and achieved those targets, you could save 1 million lives a year, just air pollution alone, and similarly the other things that you mentioned. So I think we need to also communicating very concretely. The second thing is, I think, the standards. I think governments can do a lot by setting standards, by setting high standards actually are not compromising on that, and also having incentives for companies that are moving more quickly towards green energy and reducing their emissions, so a carrot and stick approach. The first one is really measuring, defining, and making clear to people. And then the third is, I think, we need to engage communities, civil society. I think it has to be inclusive. I think the solutions need to come. And then you mentioned technology transfer. The WHO has set up the technology transfer program for vaccines. We need to do this for other technologies as well. There are plenty of technologies out there, but we need to start scaling those.
Right.
Thank you. Jane Burston from a philanthropic organisation called the Clean Air Fund. I've got a kind of note about an intervention that exists and then two questions, if I may. So the forum last year at the COP launched something called the Alliance for Clean Air, which is a group of 10 multinational companies coming together to work on air pollution reduction in addition to climate change, because they recognise all of this, these health effects that you're talking about. And some of the comments that they made when they were joining is that they can see that, wherever they are in the world, employees are very motivated by looking after their health. As Dr. Swaminathan was saying, 9 out of 10 people are breathing in dirty air, so it's common to us all. And some of the companies very inspiringly have joined so as to avoid climate and health mistakes of the future. So, the kind of Dieselgate type issue, making sure that climate action is healthy. So it's good news, but my question for FICA is, there's 10 companies. There's some interest, more are likely to join at COP next year. I mean, that's nowhere near enough companies prioritising. I mean, I know air pollution is only one part of climate and health, but that's nowhere near enough companies kind of looking at this crossover. What do you think is holding people back from joining these two issues together in the private sector? And then my question for the other two panellists is kind of the same but flipped for the health sector. We see the departments for environment very often talking about the need to get the health minister involved in the countries that we work in, and then the health minister not getting involved. And I wondered how often you see climate being brought up in the health forums that you're part of, and what you think we could do to increase the amount that happens. Thank you.
I'm glad you asked the question, and I had some very interesting experience this week, and I mentioned it a few times in speeches in the beginning of the week, discussing with the Egyptian ministers and the high-level champion for the COP, all the commitments from the private sector to the COP27 in Egypt in November. And I said, we have also a group next to the group you mentioned, the group that I founded in 2015 of 30, today 125 multinational companies, CEO, climate leaders addressing that. So I explained it, and he said, impressive. 125,000 companies you represent? I said, no, you misread me, 125 companies. He said, oh, that's impressive as well. And I said, gee, fair point. I mean, no, it's not impressive. And we discussed here in Davos in some groups, I will not mention the groups, where half of the groups were member, even big multinational companies, of that group of 125 companies. And Al Gore mentioned also a few times, and let me mention it, to those who don't join and don't commit, maybe a shame to you, why not? Why are you here discussing all these topics and do not put your actions also there? And I think we need to be more clear, more vocal to those companies who do not join, but have those discussions, sit on the tables, etc., and do not really do. Equally, to be honest, we can also accuse myself and companies like myself, why do we have only 125? Why not every member find 10 or 100 other companies in the world, put effort in that, to get them also on board? Because with a small group of companies, we can lead, we can show it, but we cannot achieve it. So therefore, we need a much broader group. So I love your question, and I see it more as an assignment to me and to us than as a question, because you're right. Otherwise, we don't achieve it.
So we're very nearly out of time, but Mauricio,
Yeah.
can I just let you have a final word?
Just a quick comment on the boundaries between ministries. So this new generation of crisis is also about blurring those boundaries. They don't exist anymore because these problems are so interconnected. They don't even exist within universities. You need to bring in all the talent, all the knowledge to basically create awareness, measure, advance the technologies. In the case of the finance and health ministries, I think the relationship between these two ministries has to be revamped. It's not about just the allocation of the budget. For example, one way in which we can actually make a lot of progress is if we make these problems also opportunities, say job opportunities. So the climate economy, it's a great way of advancing the solutions because they're going to generate jobs. And the health sector has to do the same, new jobs, because the solution to these problems really requires new jobs. So I think we need to kind of like re-articulate the way we're dealing with issues because of the magnitude of the new generation of crisis.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. The magnitude of the new generation of crises has become too large for us to be able to constrain within the half an hour that we have. But I hope that we've at least attempted to scratch the surface on this interconnection, the fundamental interconnection between climate change and health, and started to scratch the surface in terms of how we can, as a global community, private and public sector together, respond to the scale of the magnitude of that threat. Thank you very much for joining us today. If you're interested in finding out more about what the World Economic Forum is doing on climate change and health, then please reach out to any of the climate change team. Thank you. And thank you to our panelists.